This is Reset. I'm Sasha-Ann Simons. Before there was the Grand Ole Opry, there was the National Barn Dance.
Well, folks, that old harvest moon is shining down extra bright on the old red barn tonight, and for a very special reason. Yes, the Alka-Seltzer National Barn Dance Gang is celebrating its 9th birthday, its 470th Happy Hayloft party from the old WLS Hayloft in Chicago.
The variety show combined rural and folk music, theatrical skits, and comedy. It's credited with popularizing the country music genre, and it got its start 100 years ago in Chicago. So to mark the anniversary of the first episode hitting the airwaves, an event at the Hideout titled Hey Hey, the Gang's All Here, a Chicago Barn Dance, we'll imagine what an episode of the show would sound like today. Saturday's event will bring together musicians, historians, and performers, and it will air live on WFMT. Paul DeRica is a Chicago historian who produced the event with Pocket Guide to Hell. That's a series of interactive historical tours and walks to engage the public. Welcome back to the show, Paul.
Thank you so much for having me.
Jeffrey Thomas is the musical director for the show. Welcome to Reset, Jeffrey.
Thank you.
And Lawrence Peters, founder of the Lawrence Peters Outfit, is in the event's house band. Hey, Lawrence.
Hey there, Sasha.
Good to see you.
Likewise.
All right, let's start with you, Paul. Tell us more about Barn Dance, because this was a really popular show, right?
It was a hugely popular show.
Yeah.
So it premieres in April of 1924, and it has a very kind of humble beginning, because radio in itself is just sort of coming into being. And in fact, if you look at the listing in the newspaper for the day, it said it was going to be an old-time fiddlers program.
Mm-hmm.
But by the following week, they've already come up with the name, the Barn Dance, called the Evening Barn Dance. And by week 3, they're the National Barn Dance. And through the 1920s, all the way up through the 1950s, you see it growing in popularity, both locally and across the country, and really kind of helping to create country music as we know it today.
Yeah. Jeffrey, you had a neighbor whose family member was in a band that played on the show.
Yes, his father was the bass player. Lester Shine.
Lester Shine.
Yeah.
I mean, you had to have heard some stories about Mr. Lester.
Oh, yeah, many stories. So that's how I actually found out about the barn dance, just hanging out with my neighbor, meeting him. And he knew I was a musician, and he told me about his father being the bass player of the barn dance, told me about the barn dance, told me some fun stories about after the barn dance, all the musicians would go over to one of their houses and play poker all night. And my neighbor told me that he knew his dad did well when there'd be a stack of quarters the next day and he could go get some ice cream.
That sounds about right. Now, I recently spoke with Francesca Royster. She's the author of Black Country Music, Listening for Revolutions. She'll be participating in the show on Saturday. And here, she talked to me about her grandmother. Her grandmother moved to Chicago from the South and also listened to the Barn Dance show. So here's a little bit of Francesca.
She was a big fan. She loved to listen regularly, and it was a way to kind of connect to the South, to country culture in the middle of Chicago. But I also found out that she was teased for it, by my grandfather and by her neighbors. It was something that she kind of did on the down low a little bit. Coming from the South and being here in Chicago, there was really a pressure to assimilate, to kind of be part of Northern culture. Country music was thought of as, not as sophisticated, and, to become like the right kind of Black person, urban Black person, you were supposed to listen to jazz or R&B and even like urban blues. And so to me, that tells me just the complex ways that Black listeners entered into the country music culture.
So I admit, when I was talking to her, that part about getting teased for listening to the show, that kind of surprised me. But there are reports from the first station manager of WLS, where the show debuted, that Sears Roebuck, who owned the station, and officials, they were upset at the, quote, disgraceful lowbrow music. But the overwhelming audience approval for the show is what kind of kept it going. Now, does any of that sound familiar to you all? Lawrence, I saw you nodding a little bit when Francesca was speaking.
Oh my God, it's so complicated. The complexity of country music, and it's fascinating. I have a lot of African American friends who have talked about how their families loved country music, and the older ones would listen to the WLS Barn Dance, or the Grand Ole Opry.
The Grand Ole
and that
Opry.
they just loved it, and because they heard, even though it was, sort of acknowledged as a white, quote unquote, music, there's all that African American influence in it.
Yeah.
And they heard it, and they loved the songs, the stories, like all that stuff is in there.
Right.
And so But it just the idea of somebody being made fun of for that is just brutal.
Yeah, I was teased. Paul?
I would just add that, you mentioned that WLS was owned by Sears. WLS stood for World's Largest Store. And even though they were hesitant at first because they thought it was like a low-brow sort of art form, what they realized, being Sears, is that they had a huge rural audience that appreciated this music, and also a large number of people now living in Chicago who had come from rural communities. And they not only had to create content for their station, but they were in the business of selling radios.
Yeah.
So people needed something to tune into when they were out there. And so there was a really good synergy between, Sears being able to kind of sell their radios kind of across the country, and then people being able to tune in and listen to the Barn Dance on Saturdays.
Yeah. Let's listen to an early song that aired on Barn Dance. This is Fit as a Fiddle by the Hoosier Hotshots.
I can jump over the moon up above, and the fiddle and ready for love.
It's taking everything for me to not get up out of my seat right now. Jeffrey, a big smile came on your face when the song first started. What memories did that bring back?
Well, I was listening to it trying to figure out what that sound was.
Me too.
What is that?
Slide whistle?
Slide whistle.
My
maybe?
producer and I were trying to figure it out too. We were like, is it the flute?
Exactly. And that hearing that makes me actually excited me because of even just the diversity of sounds that could be played on on the radio at the time, and that's what brought me a big smile. Was like, what is that noise?
What is that sound?
What is that beautiful weird sound?
I'm just tapping my toes over here. Well, at this time, you bring a good point, Jeffrey, because at this time there were many different styles of music that were played on the Barn Dance show, and it wasn't called country yet, right, Lawrence? I mean, what were some of the styles, though, that we could hear on the program?
Boy. It was a completely different landscape.
Yeah.
From my understanding, that it was less segmented and compartmentalized, and so it was just sort of rural music and city music or whatever, like jazz.
Folk.
Yeah, there were some things that were definitely like jazz, of course, and ragtime and that kind of thing. But I think it was a lot looser genre, and I think that a lot of things fit in that, which is really cool.
There was a huge migration of folks from rural areas to cities at this time. So, Paul, I want you to talk a bit about how missing home and that desire to connect to the music, how that created a market for Barn Dance.
It did create a market that was local, but then that also extended out into rural communities as well, and allowed the people living here in Chicago to connect back to their pasts. But it also allowed people in rural communities to feel some kind of connection to urban areas. And one of the things that I found fascinating and a really good history to check out is Mark Reno's Country and Midwestern, and he writes about this, is how in a lot of these rural communities, maybe one family in a given area had a radio set. So people would come from all around on Saturday nights to listen together to the Barn Dance. And that really helped to kind of create a sense of community. And in some cases, the same pattern played out here within Chicago.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious when it officially became country music.
When would you say?
Lawrence? I forget I always forget the guy's name. The guy that did the Bristol sessions, I believe, is the guy that termed, he split it into hillbilly music and race records, and so he ethnically and color-wise divided the two into different things and then marketed them separately. And that was my understanding of how that went. And that was around that time, I think. I think the Bristol sessions. Do you remember when
It was a little bit after, but yeah.
Yeah, shortly after that. So, yeah.
Well, Barn Dance, as we know, eventually went off the airwaves. But as I mentioned earlier, you all wanted to take the format and think about what it would sound like now. Where'd you get this idea from, Paul?
I think just, looking at the long history of the Barn Dance. So, it goes on the air in April of 1924. It runs on WLS all the way till 1960. Then it's on for GN for a decade. And it's just kind of amazing that a program was on the air that long through all those different decades and engaging all those different kind of people. And so it just was a simple kind of leap of imagination. The Grand Ole Opry's still here, right? The Grand Ole Opry goes on the air a couple years after the Barn Dance. It's originally called the WSM Barn Dance, right? So you can see the way in which it's indebted to what happened here in Chicago. And so it was just like, yeah, what if it never went off the air? What would it look like today? How could we celebrate the Chicago country music scene that exists today and the past century worth of music?
Well, now for the part that I've been waiting for. Jeffrey, you and Lawrence, you came up with a theme song for your event this weekend. Hey, hey, the gang's all here, a Chicago barn dance. Why don't you play a little bit of it for us?
Hold on.
Oh, he's got to get his washboard on. That's an electric washboard, folks.
Fancy instruments coming out.
You give a little note. 1, 2, 3, 4. Everybody gather round and clap your hands. Hey, hey, the gang's all here. Just tap your toes if you don't want to dance. Hey, hey, the gang's all here. Gonna tell some tales and sing some songs. We'll all be friends before the night is gone. Let's get started because we haven't got long. Hey, hey, the gang's all here. Hey, hey, the gang's all here. Hey, hey, the gang's all here.
Yay!
Little loose.
I love that.
Loose.
Why don't you talk, Jeffrey, about how this song helps capture the spirit of the event?
Well, Lawrence wrote it. Lawrence wrote all the words and came up with that melody. And I was already working on a sort of a chord progression based on Eldon Shamblin, Texas Playboys kind of groove. And once Lawrence sent me his version of it, I just knew I could this will just map right on top of it. Nice. So it had to be short, had to be punchy, had to talk about dancing and being all here together and having a good time and be real short and punchy. Yeah. So we did kind of our own little sort of acoustic version of it, but at the show, we're going to have everybody sing.
All the bells and whistles.
The lyrics are still in my I'm still singing, hey, hey, the gang's all here.
I really appreciate that.
So it worked for sure.
Thank you.
Excellent.
All right, let's listen again to author Francesca Royster. She says this event provides an opportunity
to think about the histories of exclusion, both kind of the self-segregation of African Americans from this culture, but also the ways that the industry itself was racially segregated and unwelcoming for Black listeners. So this reimagining gives us a chance to think about, okay, what if we knew what we knew then that we know now in terms of the importance of African American roots in country music, participation and fandom, and try to rethink the space.
Yeah, does she have a point there, Paul?
She does, very much so. And I think that's what really kind of guided us as we were developing this program. We wanted to take a full and complete look at the history of the barn dance, and we wanted to also take a full and complete look at what country music is in the city today. And I think, Jeff did such an amazing job. When I said, don't think about it as like being in the past, but think about like what would the show look like if it were on in 2024? Who would be the musicians you'd reach out to? Jeff did such an amazing job in getting all these people to join us on this project.
Yeah, talk more about that. You are the event's musical director, Jeffrey. So how do you go about thinking about something like this and making it sound like 2024?
I knew if I had some key country players in there, Justin Brown on pedal steel, Matt Gandersky on country lead guitar, and of course Lawrence Peters. He's been my guru throughout this whole thing. But I also wanted to look out new country artist, Andrew Saw. He's singing a song. Nikki Morgan's going to be on it. But I also wanted to throw in some wild cards. Marvin Tate, who's going to do his version of Mule Skinner Blues. And Hawk Nebula is going to do his version of Wichita Lineman. And I picked a lot of musicians that were both young and new upcoming musicians that can improvise in the jazz scene, as well as a very versatile Foley artist, Brent Roman, who was from Cirque du Soleil. And he's got a whole bag of tricks that he's going to be busting out for us at the show. But it was a deliberate choice to sort of look at the broad range of musical talent here in Chicago and sort of fit them into this style in some way, with some key country players too.
If you're just tuning in, this is Reset. I'm Sasha-Ann Simons. We are marking the 100-year anniversary of the first broadcast of Barn Dance with Paul DeRica, who's a Chicago historian who produced an upcoming event. Jeffrey Thomas is the musical director for the show, and Lawrence Peters is founder of the Lawrence Peters Outfit. He's also in the event's house band. The event this Saturday, if you want that energy, it's called Hey, Hey, the Gang's All Here, a Chicago barn dance. It'll be at the Hideout on April 20th. So you mentioned a few artists there, Jeffrey, and I think we've got some So a little taste of
nice.
that Nikki Morgan.
Oh, right.
Nikki's from North Carolina, but got started performing here in Chicago. She's been quoted as saying that storytelling is important to her and to the genre of country. So let's listen to Water to Wine off her EP 30-something.
And what are you doing? The seed you knew would outgrow you has somehow fallen through. And where do you go when the shadows they grow?
What a voice.
About it.
Let's talk about
about
that.
it.
But, her point of, storytelling and its importance to this genre. I remember just years ago when I hadn't really listened to too much country music and just hearing, oh, but you got to, because they tell stories like no other.
Oh yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah, for
you
sure.
agree?
Oh, 100%. Yeah, I think it's the storytelling genre. It really is. And what's remarkable, so my particular discipline within country music is honky tonk, which is so like Hank Williams and that kind of stuff. And it's there's a form to it which I really like. It's kind of like you have to fit your story in a lean and mean way within this structure.
That's right.
And you really have to think about what you want to say, and you can't waste the space. It's kind of like writing a sonnet or something like that. It has to all fit in the right spot. But it comes from traditions of people keeping cultural histories and stories and lore alive, but then also just daily stuff. I mean, the wonderful thing about honky tonk is that it's nightlife and day life. So there's a lot about divorce and whatever, and it's kind of comical. There's a lot of jabs about how country music is about your dog and whatever, but it's about your. It's about,
I've heard that too.
Yeah, totally. But it's about I miss my home. I'm single now. I'm divorced. Whatever. The kids don't like me. All these kinds of things,
right.
which can be hilarious to look at from the outside. But it's like, well, that's some real heartfelt stuff, and it can be really beautiful. And I've heard some just mind-blowingly, incredibly beautiful songs about just talking about being a human being. So
for sure.
Three chords and the truth.
There you go. Exactly right.
I want to listen to another one of the artists featured this weekend. This is Los Gallos, and the song is Nueva Vida on their new self-titled album. So Jeffrey, tell us more about this group and the story you're hoping to tell by having them be part of the event.
Well, the norteño sound is something that I grew up in listening to in Texas, and my next door neighbors have wonderful parties with large band, and I knew I wanted to, if I was going to help tell the story or help bring in the sound of a new Chicago country sound, certainly the Hispanic influence and the Mexican influence had to be a part of it as well. And Los Gallos, I saw them at the Hideout and was just floored.
Yeah,
just
they're great.
Moved by them. And
I went down a rabbit hole watching a bunch of their performances this morning on YouTube.
And getting them in the show was really meaningful to me to have them there. It's going to be a little tricky turnover, but we're going to make it work to get them up there to do a good song. They're doing their song Michoacan.
Ooh.
It's going to be a wonderful, wonderful moment. So.
And Paul, there seems to be this overall line of continuity from the early days of barn dance to today's music scene, right? Talk briefly about how some original participants kind of went on to teach the next generation of musicians.
That's very true. A lot of the musicians who performed on the barn dance ended up staying in the Chicago area. A lot of them became, music instructors or helped to kind of establish places that we still have today, like the Old Town School of Folk Music, and would perform there. Mm-hmm. And so then they taught the next generation, and then the generation after that taught some of the individuals who will be performing with us. And there are some direct links between the barn dance and the people that will be performing on Saturday. So we've got a band called the Girls of the Golden West.
Nice.
One of its members, her great aunt, was in a band called Girls of the Golden West
Nice.
that performed on the barn dance. Our square dance caller, Paul Collins, amazing guy.
Yeah, there will be a square dance in the middle of the two live shows.
His grandfather took him to the barn dance. It used to be performed live for many, many years at a place called A Street Theater. He remembers going with his grandfather to see it, becoming really kind of interested in the music, and then going with his parents to do square dancing at YMCA's on the city's south side.
Oh, nice.
And he's been a caller since he was a teenager.
Nice.
That is super cool. Well, we'll leave it there. I want to go out, though, on one more song. This one's from Andrew Saw, who's been dubbed Chicago's queer country crooner. This is Little Lamb. We have been speaking with Paul DeRica, who's a Chicago historian who produced Hey Hey, The Gang's All Here, a Chicago barn dance, Jeffrey Thomas, who's the musical director for the show, and Lawrence Peters, who's founder of the Lawrence Peters Outfit, who's also in the event's house band. Thank you all so much.
Thanks
for
so
having
much.
This was
thank you.
fun.
Yeah, thank
We
you.
will have a bonus episode on Saturday on our podcast where we'll dig into Beyonce's latest album, Cowboy Carter,
Yeah, buddy.
with author Francesca Royster. You'll hear my full conversation with her on the podcast.